Malcolm X, a complicated and powerful name in American history. Essentially, he was a leader and inspiration for many in the African American community and beyond. An early and powerful spokesman for the Nation of Islam, he worked to gain the group's political and religious recognition. Malcolm X was one of the nation's most famous proponents of Black nationalism, and he helped influence many changes in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X led and changed the lives of many people, and this is what makes him a great representation of what it means to be a frontier.
Malcolm Little was born into a mixed household on May 19, 1925, with an African American father and a mixed mother who was described as, quote-unquote, not looking white. His mother, Louise Little, was very well educated and had a much better childhood than Malcolm's father, Earl Little. When Malcolm Little was born in the mid-1920s, the KKK was in a state of resurgence with over 400,000 members. Malcolm was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and his family eventually moved to the Midwest because of the persistent harassment from the KKK and the lack of acceptance of his community into white communities. They lived in Wisconsin for 2 years before moving back to Michigan in 1928.
Both Louise and Earl Little died when Malcolm was a young age. This series of familial tragedies led him to being placed into a series of foster homes with his siblings for the remainder of his childhood years. As a young man, he was popular and excelled academically, but he was never allowed to escape the culturally imposed status of quote-unquote inferior as a young Black man in a white society. A pivotal moment in his life came when a teacher criticized his aspirations as unrealistic for a Black man. Malcolm X wanted to become a lawyer, and during that time it was extremely uncommon for a person of color to become a lawyer. But this persistence is again another example of Malcolm X being a frontier.
During this time, he dropped out of middle school and moved to Boston to find work as a shoe shiner and later as a drug dealer, gambler, and burglar. Malcolm was eventually arrested for burglary and sentenced to 10 years in prison and ended up spending 6.5 years in 3 different Massachusetts prisons, and he recalled this to be one of the most decisive times in his life. During this time, Malcolm began to take more interest in furthering his education. Malcolm was also informed during this period by his brother about the Nation of Islam and was encouraged to further look into the Muslim faith. Around this time, in the early 60s, the civil rights movement began its emergence, as well as multiple anti-war protests.
Malcolm X was released from prison in 1952 and continued to pursue the Muslim religion even outside of prison. He changed his surname from Little to X to symbolize the loss of his slave name and the X that many slaves were branded with during those times. It was believed to be a radical thing to do, but this would later be a decision that would help shape him as the frontier that he was known as.
Around with these names, and therefore he teaches us that during slavery, the same slave master who owned us put his last name on us to denote that we were his property.
Malcolm was eventually appointed as the national spokesman and minister for the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is a religious and political organization founded in the United States. Malcolm X was a part of the establishment in multiple mosques, a place of Muslim worship around America. Malcolm began preaching violence as the answer to the oppression the people were facing at this time.
Malcolm X began inviting MLK, another frontier for Black nationalism, to gatherings on the topic of African American rights. Malcolm did not agree with MLK's stand on nonviolence and thought the only way to get his message to have any significant impact on others was through violence. Although Malcolm did not agree with MLK, the two got along and were still on good terms. Although Malcolm rejected King's message of nonviolence, he respected King as a fellow leader of their people. He would send the Nation of Islam articles to King as early as 1957.
1 year later, Malcolm married Betty Jean Dean on January 14th, 1958. Together they had 6 girls. Malcolm eventually set up a newspaper to publish more information on the Islamic religion and as well to help support his family. Malcolm combined both Islam and Black nationalism to expand his preachings and the information he covered. Malcolm believed that Islam could rid the world of racism and that there was only one religion to hold this power.
I believe in the religion of Islam, which believes in brotherhood, complete brotherhood of all people.
Malcolm continued to preach the Islamic religion and how people can use this religion to erase the issue of racism. And in 1963, Malcolm visited Mecca, and his views on the Muslim and Islam religions changed. He started distancing himself from the violence he used to preach about.
Malcolm used to preach that fighting back against their oppressors was the only way to accomplish anything. After this trip, Malcolm's opinions on his old stance began to sway away.
You and I have to let the man know is we are peaceful people. We are loving people. We love everybody who loves us. But we don't love anybody who doesn't love us.
In honor of this spiritual change that Malcolm went through, he changed his name yet again. He then became El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. Once in the Nation of Islam, Malcolm befriended the famous Muhammad Ali, but it was only a brief friendship that proved to be very beneficial. The two met at the NOI rally, and Muhammad had a great first impression. In Muhammad's words, "My first impression of Malcolm X was how could a black man talk about the government and white people and act so bold and not be shot at?" The boxer later recalled, "He was fearless. That really attracted me."
In June of 1964, Malcolm X founded the Afro-American Unity, OAAU. This organization fought for the human rights of African Americans. The group was founded on Malcolm X's 5 views on unity. Restoration, meaning connecting back with their African roots. Reorientation, meaning learning as much as they could about their heritage. And education, this was used to liberate their minds and be able to think freely. Economic security, which symbolized their own freedom to exercise economics freely. Self-defense, and in the words of Malcolm X, we encourage the Afro-Americans to defend themselves against the wanton attacks of the racist aggressors whose sole aim is to deny us the guarantee of the United States Charter of Human Rights and the Constitution of the United States. This was Malcolm X's intro into making changes in the civil rights movement and being able to spread his beliefs freely.
An important and critical time in Malcolm's career was the infamous speech done by him called "The Bullet or the Ballot." In this speech, Malcolm encouraged African Americans to exercise their right to vote. Malcolm mentions in the speech that if the government was going to continue to not allow African Americans to obtain full equality, they have to take up arms. This speech inspired many people to fight harder for their full and equal right to vote. A famous quote from this speech: "Don't be throwing out any ballots. A ballot is like a bullet. You don't throw your ballots until you see a target. And if the target is not within your reach, keep your ballot in your pocket."
Get this and understand this, that the ballot is as powerful as the bullet.
1965 was the year of Malcolm X's assassination. Malcolm X was speaking at the Audubon Ballroom on February 21st, 1965, with his whole family present. His wife Betty was pregnant with their 5th and 6th children during this time. His oldest daughter, Adela, was 6 years old at the time of her father's death. Kabaya was 4, Sila was 2, and Gamaya was a little over a year. And Malk and Malachi were a few months away from birth. 3 men rushed the stage and shot Malcolm at close range, using a shotgun and 2 handguns. Autopsies of Malcolm after death showed that he had dealt 21 gunshot wounds ranging from his chest to his arms and legs. 1 man was caught by the police, and the other 2 were apprehended later. The 3 men were members of the Nation of Islam, just like Malcolm. These men did not like the messages that Malcolm was spreading. They disapproved of Malcolm's new position against violence and decided to kill Malcolm due to those views.
All 3 men were eventually captured and convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. MLK responded to the death of Malcolm by saying, "While we did not always see eye to eye on methods to solve the race problem, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and felt that he had the great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem." The entire African American and Islam communities were devastated over the loss of such a powerful leader. Although not everyone may have agreed with his views and opinions, his large impact on equality and the voices within those communities can be respected no matter what stand. In the end, Malcolm brought along a new frontier in many ways. He displayed courage and persistence throughout his life. Not only was Malcolm a spokesperson for the African American community, but the Islam community as well. He provided many outlets for people to use their voices that were previously not available until Malcolm brought along this frontier of freedom and equality. He was able to open multiple places of Muslim worship, along with newspaper articles and the organization of the Afro-American Unity. While Malcolm faced adversity throughout the entirety of his life, he never let others' antics slow him down and continued sharing his plan on how to achieve fair treatment and equality for all groups of people. Malcolm X possessed the incredible ability to speak to large groups of people and leave an impact on every last one. Through Malcolm's substantial contributions to both the African American and Islamic communities, he was able to carry a frontier whose impacts are still seen today.